The medieval world holds stories and habits that feel distant, strange, and sometimes quietly unsettling. Tonight, we will drift slowly through the everyday facts of medieval life. Not the great battles or famous kings, but the small details. The ordinary moments that filled the days and nights of millions of people who lived long before us. Before we begin, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Let your shoulders relax. If you like, pull a blanket a little closer around you. If you enjoy these calm history wanderings, you're welcome to subscribe. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. It's always interesting to see how many quiet corners of the world are awake together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe let a small fan hum softly in the background. Take one slow breath in and let it go. Tonight, we're not rushing anywhere. We're stepping into a world where time moved slowly, where days were shaped by sunlight, weather, and bells, where most people never traveled far from home, and the future was something felt more than planned. These are medieval history facts meant for gentle listening. When we talk about medieval times, it's easy to imagine castles, knights, or long stone halls. But for most people, medieval life was not dramatic. It was slow, repetitive, and deeply tied to the natural world. There were no clocks on walls for most of the medieval period. Time was not counted in minutes. It was felt. Morning began when light entered the home. Not at a specific hour, but when it was bright enough to work. In many villages, bells marked the passing of the day. A bell for morning prayers, another for midday, another for evening. These bells did not just signal religion. They structured life. Without them, most people would not know what time it was. Seasons mattered more than dates. People didn't think in terms of months the way we do now. They thought in terms of planting time, harvest time, cold time. Winter was not just a season, it was a test. Food stores ran low. Travel slowed or stopped entirely. Darkness arrived early, stretching the nights long. A medieval year was not evenly lived. Summer passed quickly with exhausting labor. Winter dragged on, quiet and still. Most medieval people lived in the same place their entire lives. Many never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. The world felt small and complete. News traveled slowly. Sometimes it arrived months late. Sometimes never. If something happened far away, it might as well have happened in another universe. Writing was rare. Reading even rarer. Information was passed through voices. Stories repeated again and again until they changed shape. Memory mattered more than records. People remembered through repetition, through rituals, prayers, and habits. Everyday life followed patterns so familiar they barely needed thought. Wake with the light. Work until the body tired. Eat what was available. Sleep when darkness arrived. There were no weekends. Rest came when the body forced it or when the church calendar allowed it. Religious feast days provided breaks in the endless routine. They were moments of color in otherwise muted lives. For many medieval people, life felt endless. Not because it was long, but because each day resembled the last. Time did not rush, it stretched. And in that slowness, people learned patience, whether they wanted to or not. Fear existed quietly in the background. Fear of illness, fear of hunger, fear of bad weather. But so did acceptance. Medieval people accepted uncertainty as part of life. There was little illusion of control, and strangely, that acceptance often brought calm. As the day ended, darkness took over completely. No streetlights, no glowing windows. Night was truly dark, and with night came rest and stories and silence. A medieval home was never truly quiet, never truly clean, and almost never still. It was a living space in the most literal sense, filled with movement, sound, heat, and the constant presence of both people and animals. From the outside, many medieval houses looked plain and unremarkable, built from wood, mud, or rough stone. But inside, they were busy, crowded places where life pressed in from every direction. Light was scarce. Windows, if they existed at all, were small openings cut into thick walls. Glass was expensive and rare, so most windows were covered with oiled cloth, animal hide, or wooden shutters that were closed tightly at night, and often kept partially shut even during the day. Sunlight entered in narrow beams, leaving most of the interior in shadow. On cloudy days or during winter, homes could remain dim from morning until nightfall, with only the faint glow of a hearth to provide warmth and visibility. Fire was the heart of the medieval home. It cooked food, warmed bodies, and served as the main source of light once the sun disappeared. Most houses had a central hearth rather than a fireplace with a chimney. Smoke had nowhere to go except up into the room, drifting toward the ceiling before slowly leaking out through small roof openings or gaps in the thatch. The air inside was often thick with soot. Walls darkened over time, beams turned black, and lungs filled with smoke day after day. Coughing was common, especially among the elderly and the very young. The smell of smoke never truly left. Clothes absorbed it. Hair carried it. Even food tasted faintly of ash. For medieval people, this scent was not unpleasant, it was familiar. Clean air, by comparison, would have felt strange and empty. Animals shared these spaces freely. In poorer homes, livestock such as chickens, goats, or pigs were often brought indoors at night. They provided warmth during cold months and protection from thieves or predators. A cow sleeping near the hearth was not unusual in rural areas. The sounds of animals breathing, shifting, or softly bleating blended into the background of nightly life. Dogs were common companions, valued for protection and hunting. Cats were tolerated, even welcomed, for their ability to control mice and rats. But their presence also meant fur, fleas, and scratches. Animals tracked in mud, manure, and insects, adding to the already crowded and messy environment. Insects were everywhere. Fleas lived in bedding, straw, and clothing. Lice clung to hair and seams. Flies gathered around food and waste, especially in warmer months. Medieval homes were not sealed spaces. Cracks in walls, open floors, and thatched roofs allowed insects to move freely in and out. People scratched without thinking. It was simply part of life. Beds were not soft or private. Most were made of wooden frames or simple platforms filled with straw, hay, or dried leaves. These materials broke down quickly, becoming damp and infested. Bedding was shared by family members, guests, and sometimes servants. Privacy was rare. Entire households slept in one room, rising and resting together. Noise was constant. A crackle of firewood, a clatter of cooking pots, the shuffling of feet on packed earth floors. Wooden houses creaked as temperatures changed. Wind pushed through gaps, causing shutters to rattle and roof thatch to whisper. At night, the sounds of animals and insects grew louder. Rats moved through walls. Mice gnawed at stored grain. Outside, dogs, owls called, and distant human voices carried far in the darkness. Silence, as we understand it today, barely existed. Smells layered on top of one another. Cooking odors mixed with smoke, sweat, animals, and waste. There were no separate kitchens or bathrooms. Waste was often collected in buckets or pits, emptied occasionally into nearby fields or streets. In towns, open drains ran along roads, carrying away refuse slowly and imperfectly. The air carried a mix of dampness, decay, and human presence. Yet medieval people adapted. Their senses adjusted. What would overwhelm a modern visitor felt normal to them. Smell was information. It told them if food was spoiling, if animals were nearby, if rain was coming, if something was burning too hot. Homes were also workspaces. People spun wool, repaired tools, prepared food, and cared for children all within the same small area. There was no separation between labor and rest. Life unfolded in a single shared space, hour after hour, season after season. In winter, homes grew darker and more crowded. Cold air seeped in through walls and floors, pushing people closer to the hearth. Families huddled together for warmth. The fire burned longer, and smoke thickened. Days felt short, evenings endless. Shadows stretched across walls, flickering with every movement of flame. Candles existed, but they were expensive and used sparingly. Most were made of tallow, which produced a heavy smell and dripped greasy wax. A single candle might be saved for important tasks or religious observance. For everyday life, firelight was enough. Children grew up surrounded by this environment. They learned early to avoid sparks, to step around animals, to tolerate smoke in their eyes. Their understanding of home was not a quiet refuge, but a bustling, sensory-filled place. Even wealthier medieval homes were not entirely comfortable. Stone houses retained cold and dampness. Drafts slipped through heavy doors and narrow windows. Large halls echoed with voices and footsteps. Fireplaces existed, but heating was uneven. One side of the room might be warm, while another remained freezing. Tapestries and wall hangings served practical purposes. They added insulation, reduced drafts, and absorbed sound. They also trapped dust and insects, becoming homes within homes. At night, darkness claimed most of the space beyond the hearth's glow. Corners disappeared, objects blurred. People moved carefully, guided by memory more than sight. Falling or stumbling was common. Injuries happened easily. Despite all this, medieval homes were places of familiarity and belonging. Within the smoke and noise, people found rhythm. They recognized the creak of their own roof, the sound of their animals, the way the fire behaved on damp days. Home was not about comfort. It was about survival. And as the night deepened, with the fire settling into glowing embers and the animals growing still, medieval households drifted into sleep together, surrounded by warmth, darkness, and the quiet life moving just beneath the surface. Sleep in the medieval world was not a smooth descent into darkness, followed by an uninterrupted night. It was something lighter, more cautious, and often broken into pieces. For medieval people, sleep was a state entered carefully, never fully trusted, and rarely free from interruption. Most people did not sleep straight through the night. Instead, they followed a rhythm that feels unfamiliar today. After sunset, once the fire had dimmed and the day's work had finally slowed, families lay down for what was known as the first sleep. This early rest began soon after darkness fell. It was deep and heavy, shaped by exhaustion rather than comfort. Bodies worn down by physical labor sank quickly into stillness. This first sleep often lasted a few hours. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, people naturally woke. This waking was not considered strange or troubling. It was expected. Medieval writings, letters, and court records quietly mention this period between sleeps as an ordinary part of life. People used this time to pray, reflect, tend the fire, or even visit neighbors if the moon was bright enough. Some whispered with family members. Others sat quietly, listening to the sounds of the night. A few returned to small tasks left unfinished during the day. Only after this pause did people return to rest, entering what was called the second sleep. This sleep was usually lighter and shorter, ending closer to dawn. Dreams were thought to occur more often during this second rest, and medieval people paid close attention to them, believing dreams carried messages, warnings, or glimpses of the future. Sleep, then, was not an escape. It was something woven into waking life, but it was also unsafe. Night brought vulnerability. Once darkness settled, medieval homes became places of limited awareness. firelight faded. Shadows deepened. Sounds carried farther and felt closer. A simple noise, a creaking beam, a shifting animal, the scrape of wind could stir unease. There were no locks as we know them now. Doors were barred, but windows and walls were thin. Fear of thieves, wild animals, or hostile strangers lingered quietly in the mind. For those living near forests or roads, the night felt especially exposed. Sleep required trust in neighbors, in animals, in walls that might not hold. Illness often revealed itself at night. Fevers rose. Breathing became labored. A cough echoed louder in the stillness. Many people feared going to sleep sick, unsure if they would wake again. Death frequently arrived during the night hours, and the stillness of darkness became closely associated with final breaths. Children slept lightly. Infants were kept close, sometimes in the same bed, sometimes wrapped tightly to prevent movement. Parents listened for changes in breathing, for cries that might signal sickness or fear. The night demanded attention even while resting. Beds themselves offered little security. Straw mattresses shifted and flattened. Insects moved freely. Fleas bit without warning. People scratched in their sleep, half aware, half dreaming. Sleep was often shallow, interrupted by discomfort long before morning. Medieval night fears were not abstract. They were shaped by belief and environment. Darkness was thought to invite unseen forces. Spirits, demons, and restless souls were believed to move more freely after sunset. Even those who did not fully believe these ideas still felt their weight. Stories repeated often enough begin to settle into the mind. People prayed before sleeping, not just out of habit, but out of caution. Short prayers were spoken quietly, asking for protection through the night. Many believed sleep left the soul vulnerable, drifting slightly away from the body, exposed to danger. Waking suddenly in the dark was common. The mind, half asleep, struggled to distinguish dream from reality. Shadows appeared to move. Sounds felt deliberate. Fear rose quickly and faded slowly. During the pause between first and second sleep, people sometimes lit the fire again, not just for warmth, but for reassurance. Flame pushed back darkness. It restored order to space. It made the world visible again. For those living in towns, the night carried different dangers. Streets were narrow and poorly lit. Watchmen patrolled, but not everywhere, and not always reliably. Fires were a constant threat. A single spark could spread quickly through wooden buildings, packed tightly together. Many people slept with the faint fear that they might be awakened by shouting, bells, or smoke. Bells, once again, played a role in the night. Church bells rang not only for prayer, but to warn of danger. Their sound in darkness carried urgency and dread. To be woken by bells meant something had gone wrong. Despite this, medieval people slept when they could. Exhaustion outweighed fear. Bodies adapted. Sleep came in layers, not stretches. Dreams were taken seriously. A troubling dream might be discussed the next day. A comforting one remembered with gratitude. Some dreams were believed to be messages sent during the vulnerable state between sleeping and waking. Others were blamed on bad air, heavy food, or spiritual unrest. Position mattered. People believed certain sleeping positions were safer than others. Lying flat on the back was sometimes discouraged, thought to invite nightmares or suffocation. Side sleeping was common, knees drawn slightly inward, conserving warmth. Night clothing was minimal. Many slept in the same garments worn during the day, especially in winter. Undressing fully was rare, both for warmth and modesty. Layers stayed on, stiff with smoke and sweat, becoming part of the sleeping body. As dawn approached, sleep lightened. Sounds returned. Birds called. Animals stirred. The second sleep faded gently, replaced by readiness to rise. Morning was not relief. It was continuation, Sleep had not erased fear or fatigue. It had simply paused them. And yet, in this broken, cautious rest, medieval people found balance. Their bodies learned a rhythm shaped by darkness, silence, and uncertainty. Sleep was not a single deep escape, but a quiet negotiation with the night. The medieval world is often imagined as endlessly filthy, a place where people never bathed and grime covered everything. But the truth is quieter and more complicated. Cleanliness existed in medieval life, though it followed rules very different from our own. People cared about being clean, but their ideas of what cleanliness meant were shaped by belief, access, habit, and fear. Bathing did happen. It simply wasn't constant. In many medieval towns, public bathhouses existed and were used regularly, especially in the early Middle Ages. These baths were social spaces as much as practical ones. People bathed together, talked, and relaxed. For some, bathing was associated with comfort and health rather than luxury. Warm water was believed to open the body, allowing impurities to escape through the skin. But bathing also carried risk. Medieval medicine taught that the body was protected by its natural balance. Too much bathing, especially in hot water, was thought to weaken the skin and make a person vulnerable to illness. Warm water opened the pores, and open pores allowed bad air, disease, and spiritual harm to enter. As plagues and epidemics spread through Europe, fear of water increased. Gradually, bathing became less frequent, not because people disliked cleanliness, but because they feared exposure. Instead of full baths, medieval people focused on partial washing. Hands, face, and feet were cleaned more often. Before meals, washing hands was expected, even among the poor. Bowls of water were passed around communal tables, and everyone took a turn. Clean hands were associated with moral order as much as hygiene. Water itself was precious. Carrying it took effort. Wells and rivers were shared resources, and in towns, water was often already used for cooking, washing clothes, and caring for animals. Bathing meant using large amounts of water for one person, which felt wasteful to many households. Soaps did exist. Medieval soap was usually made from animal fat, mixed with ash or plant-based lye. It was harsh by modern standards, often gritty and strong-smelling. Scented soaps were available in wealthier areas, sometimes infused with herbs or flowers, but these were rare. For most people, soap was practical, not pleasant. Soap was used more often on clothing than on skin. Washing clothes was considered an important form of cleanliness. Clean clothing signaled order, respectability, and health. People might go weeks without bathing fully, but they would still wash garments when possible, scrubbing them in rivers or tubs and laying them out to dry in the sun. The sun itself was a cleaning tool. Sunlight was believed to purify. Clothes, bedding, and even homes were aired out when weather allowed. Doors and shutters were opened wide to let light and fresh air move through the space, carrying away stale smells and dampness. Lice were a constant problem. They lived in hair, seams of clothing, and bedding. Their presence was not seen as a moral failure, but as an unavoidable part of life. People picked lice from one another's hair in quiet, familiar gestures. It was a common activity, often done in the evening or during moments of rest. Removing lice was both practical and strangely social. Special combs were made for this purpose, with fine teeth designed to catch insects and eggs. These combs have been found in archaeological sites across Europe, showing how widespread and accepted the practice was. Fleas, too, were ever present. They traveled easily between humans and animals. No amount of washing could fully eliminate them. Medieval people understood this and focused on control rather than elimination. Bedding was shaken out. Straw was replaced when possible. Herbs like lavender or rosemary were sometimes added to bedding to discourage insects, though their effectiveness was limited. Shared water was common. Bowls of water were used by multiple people in sequence, especially during meals or gatherings. From a modern perspective, this feels unhygienic, but medieval people valued the act of washing itself more than the purity of the water. The ritual mattered. In bathhouses, water was often reused throughout the day. Fresh water was added when possible, but complete replacement was rare. These spaces were warm, steamy, and crowded. They smelled of soap, sweat, and damp wood. For many, they were a rare comfort in otherwise hard lives. Over time, attitudes toward bathing shifted. By the later Middle Ages, bathhouses began to disappear in some regions, partly due to fears of disease and partly due to moral concerns. Bathing in groups became associated with indulgence or improper behavior. Cleanliness turned inward, focusing more on spiritual purity than physical washing. Yet people still cared about smell. Perfumes and scented oils were used to mask odors. Small cloths soaked in herbs were carried or worn. Flowers were scattered in homes. Cleanliness was managed through layers of effort rather than a single solution. Teeth were cleaned, though not with brushes. Cloths, sticks, or fingers were used to rub away food. Some used powdered herbs or crushed shells. Breath mattered. Bad breath was noticed and commented on. Hair was washed less often, but it was brushed and maintained. Coverings like caps or veils protected hair from dirt and insects. Cutting hair short was sometimes a practical decision, reducing lice and heat. The body was understood differently. Medieval people believed dirt on the skin could act as a barrier, protecting against cold and illness. Cleanliness was not about removing every trace of dirt, but about balance. Too much washing was just as dangerous as too little. Despite the limitations, medieval people were not indifferent. They adapted to what was possible. They cleaned in ways that made sense within their world. Cleanliness, then, was not absent. It was negotiated between fear and comfort, effort and belief, body and environment. Food in the medieval world was not about choice. It was about survival, habit, and timing. What people ate depended almost entirely on the season, the weather, and their place in society. Meals followed patterns so steady that most people could predict what they would be eating weeks in advance, not because of planning, but because there were few alternatives. Bread was the foundation of nearly every medieval diet. It was eaten at almost every meal, in some form, by nearly everyone. But bread was not a single thing. Its type changed depending on wealth, region, and harvest quality. For the poor, bread was dark, dense, and coarse, made from barley, rye, or a mix of grains. These loaves were heavy, filling, and often difficult to chew. They spoiled quickly and sometimes tasted sour or bitter. Wealthier households enjoyed lighter bread made from finely sifted wheat flour. This white bread was softer and easier to eat, and it became a visible marker of status. To eat white bread was to show that you had access to better grain and better milling. Bread was so central that it was often used as a plate. Thick slices, called trenchers, held food and soaked up juices before being eaten or given away. Grain shortages were feared deeply. A bad harvest could turn bread into a luxury overnight. People stretched flour with peas, beans, or even ground bark in times of desperation. Hunger crept quietly, changing the meaning of meals from comfort to calculation. Ale was the everyday drink. Water was unreliable and often unsafe, especially in towns. Ale, brewed from grains and boiled during the process, was safer to consume. It was weak by modern standards, low in alcohol, and consumed by adults and children alike. Ale provided calories and hydration. It was thick, cloudy, and filling, sometimes closer to a thin porridge than a drink. Brewing ale was a household task, often done by women. Each batch varied in taste and strength. Fresh ale was preferred, as it spoiled quickly. Stale ale turned sour and unpleasant. but it was still drunk when nothing else was available. Ale marked the rhythm of the day, consumed in the morning, during work, and with the evening meal. Meat was less common than imagined. For most people, it was an occasional addition rather than a daily staple. When meat was eaten, it was often preserved through salting or smoking. Fresh meat was rare and consumed quickly after slaughter. Pork was common, as pigs were easy to raise and could forage freely. Beef was eaten less frequently, as cattle were valuable for labor. Chicken appeared more often in rural diets, but eggs were usually more valuable than meat. Fish played a surprisingly large role in medieval diets, not because of preference, but because of religion. Fasting days shaped eating habits profoundly. The church designated many days throughout the year when meat was forbidden. These included Fridays, certain weekdays, and long stretches like Lent. On these days, people turned to fish, eggs, dairy, and plant-based foods. For the poor, fasting days did not always feel restrictive. Meat was already rare. But for the wealthy, fasting required careful planning. Elaborate fish dishes were created to maintain a sense of abundance. In some households, foods were disguised to resemble meat, using molds and seasonings, blurring the line between obedience and indulgence. Vegetables were eaten more than often assumed, but they were simple and repetitive. Cabbage, onions, leeks, beans, and peas formed the backbone of many meals. These were grown easily and stored well. Root vegetables lasted through winter, providing nourishment when nothing else remained. Herbs added what flavor they could. Salt was essential and carefully used. Spices existed, but were expensive and rare for most. When spices appeared, they were valued not just for taste, but for their perceived health benefits. Pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were believed to warm the body and aid digestion. Meals were slow and communal. People ate from shared dishes, tearing bread and dipping it into stews. Cutlery was minimal. Fingers did most of the work. Eating was practical rather than leisurely. There was little expectation of variety. Fasting days introduced monotony in another way. They created a cycle of denial and return. The anticipation of meat after a fasting period added emotional weight to meals. Food became tied to morality, obedience, and self-control. Hunger was a constant presence. Not always overwhelming, but never far away. People learned to eat enough to keep going, not enough to feel full. The body adapted to smaller portions and predictable foods. Food also marked time. Certain dishes appeared only at specific moments in the year. Fresh greens signaled spring. New grain meant relief. Preserved foods marked winter's long hold. Despite the blandness, food carried comfort. Familiar flavors grounded people. The smell of bread baking or ale brewing meant stability. In a world filled with uncertainty, predictable meals offered reassurance. Eating was less about pleasure and more about endurance. But within that endurance, medieval people found rhythm. They ate what they could, when they could, and trusted the cycle to continue. Medieval medicine was built on watching the body closely, listening to its changes, and trying to make sense of patterns that repeated themselves. It was not scientific in the modern sense, but it was not random either. It followed a logic shaped by tradition, belief, and generations of careful observation. At the center of medieval medical thinking was the theory of the four humors. These humors were believed to be the basic fluids of the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance. Illness meant imbalance. Every symptom, from a fever to sadness, was explained as one humor becoming too strong or too weak. Each humor was linked to personality and mood. Too much blood made a person energetic and restless. Excess phlegm caused sluggishness and coldness. Yellow bile was associated with anger and heat. Black bile was linked to sadness and heaviness of spirit. These ideas shaped not just medicine, but how people understood themselves and others. Doctors observed skin color, urine, pulse, appetite, and behavior. Urine examination was especially important. Its color, clarity, and smell were studied carefully. A flask of urine could reveal, in the doctor's mind, what was happening deep inside the body. Diagnosis relied on these visible signs, not on internal anatomy. Bloodletting was one of the most common treatments. If illness was caused by too much blood, then removing some seemed logical. Veins were opened with small blades, and blood was collected in bowls. The amount removed depended on the illness, the season, and even the patient's age. Bloodletting was used for headaches, fevers, infections, and emotional distress. It was not done carelessly. Medieval medical texts detailed which veins corresponded to which organs. Timing mattered. Certain days were considered safer than others. Astrology influenced treatment, with doctors consulting the position of stars and planets before proceeding. For many patients, bloodletting brought temporary relief, not because it cured disease, but because it reduced pressure or inflammation. When it failed, it was often repeated, as persistence was seen as diligence. Herbs formed the backbone of everyday healing. Medieval people had deep knowledge of plants. This knowledge was passed down orally, through practice rather than books. Leaves, roots, seeds, and flowers were used to treat pain, infection, digestion, and sleep. Some herbs worked, others did little, but each carried meaning and hope. Garlic was valued for its strength. Honey was used to clean wounds. Willow bark eased pain. Mint calmed the stomach. These remedies were gathered, dried, stored, and prepared with care. Healing was slow, patient work. Women played a major role in medicine, especially within households. Midwives, healers, and caregivers treated most everyday illnesses. Their knowledge came from experience, not formal training. They knew which plants grew where, how long they lasted, and how the body responded. Superstition blended easily with medicine. Illness was not always physical. It could be spiritual. A sudden sickness might be blamed on bad air, evil influence, or divine displeasure. Charms, prayers, and protective symbols were used alongside herbs and treatments. Amulets were worn close to the body. Written prayers were folded and stitched into clothing. Certain stones were believed to absorb illness. These practices provided comfort, structure, and a sense of control in an unpredictable world. Pain was accepted as part of life. There were few effective painkillers. Surgery existed, but was rare and dangerous. Without anesthesia, procedures were fast and brutal. Survival depended on strength and luck. Infection was poorly understood. Wounds were cleaned and dressed, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The line between healing and harm was thin. Yet medieval people noticed patterns. They knew which wounds festered and which healed cleanly. They adjusted methods slowly over time. Mental health was not separated from physical health. Sadness, anxiety, and fear were treated as imbalances of humors. Rest, diet, and gentle routine were prescribed. Music, prayer, and conversation were believed to soothe the spirit. Doctors were rare. Most people never saw one. When they did, it was often during serious illness. Medical advice varied greatly in quality. Some practitioners were thoughtful observers. Others relied heavily on tradition without question. Despite its limits, medieval medicine was deeply human. It tried to explain suffering using the tools available. It watched the body carefully, searching for order in pain. Healing was not about certainty. It was about effort. For medieval people, work was not something that began and ended at set hours. It flowed through the day, changed with the seasons, and shaped nearly every waking moment. Life was organized around labor so completely that rest felt like an interruption rather than a right. To live was to work, and to stop working often meant danger, hunger, or loss. Agriculture ruled the rhythm of medieval life. Most people worked the land, either directly or indirectly. Fields determined the calendar more than dates ever could. Spring demanded preparation. Soil had to be turned, seeds planted, fences repaired. Summer brought long days of tending crops, cutting hay, and watching the weather closely. A single storm could undo months of effort. Harvest was the most important time of all. Entire communities worked together, moving quickly to bring crops in before rain or cold arrived. Men, women, and children all had roles. Days stretched from sunrise to sunset. Exhaustion was expected. Delay was dangerous. Grain left in the field too long could rot, be eaten by animals, or be destroyed by weather. Once harvest ended, work did not disappear. Winter tasks replaced summer ones. Tools were repaired, animals were cared for. Grain was ground, clothing was mended, wood was gathered and stored. The body rested slightly, but the hands rarely did. The church calendar layered another structure onto labor. Religious feast days offered moments of pause, but they also shaped when certain types of work were permitted or forbidden. Some days were set aside for rest, prayer, and reflection. Others demanded fasting or special observance. These rules created a pattern that repeated year after year. Yet even on holy days, essential work continued. Animals still needed feeding. Fire still needed tending. The idea of complete rest was rare. Rest was partial, cautious, and often accompanied by guilt. Labor was physical and relentless. Most tools were simple. Plows required strength and coordination. Harvesting was done by hand, blade by blade. Repetition wore down bodies early. Backs bent, joints stiffened, hands hardened and cracked. Children joined the workforce young. From an early age, they helped in fields, cared for animals, or assisted in crafts. Childhood was not a protected stage of life. It was preparation. Skills were learned through doing, not instruction. Mistakes were corrected quickly, sometimes harshly. Work also defined identity. A person was known by their labor: farmer, miller, blacksmith, weaver. These roles shaped reputation, social standing, and daily routine. To lose the ability to work was to lose security. Craftsmen worked long hours, often in dim spaces. Weaving, metalwork, pottery, and leatherwork demanded focus and patience. Mistakes meant wasted materials, something few could afford. Workspaces were shared with family life. Children grew up watching hands at work, learning through observation. Markets provided moments of change. Selling goods required travel, negotiation, and exposure to other people and ideas. Market days broke routine, but they were still work. They involved hauling goods, setting prices, and competing for attention. Women's labor was constant and varied. They worked fields, managed households, prepared food, cared for children, and produced goods like cloth and dairy. Their work was often invisible in records, but essential to survival. The idea of leisure was foreign. Weather controlled everything. Rain could halt work or make it more difficult. Drought threatened crops. Cold slowed movement. Heat drained strength. Medieval people watched the sky carefully, reading signs and adjusting plans. Work did not guarantee security. Even constant labor could fail to produce enough. This uncertainty added tension to daily effort. People worked not just to improve life, but to prevent collapse. Despite the hardship, work created community. Shared labor built bonds. Neighbors helped each other during peak seasons. Collective effort made survival possible. Work also brought meaning. In a world with limited choices, labor provided structure. It filled time, shaped days, and offered a sense of purpose. Rest, when it came, was brief and deeply felt. A pause at the end of a long day. A shared meal. A quiet moment by the fire. These small breaks carried weight because work never truly stopped. Childhood in the medieval world passed quickly. often without clear boundaries separating it from adulthood. There was no long sheltered period of growing up. From an early age, children were expected to observe, learn, and contribute. Life did not pause to protect innocence. Instead, it moved forward steadily, carrying children along with it. From the moment they could walk steadily, children were present in adult spaces. They followed parents into fields, workshops, kitchens, and markets. They watched work being done and slowly began to imitate it. Learning happened through repetition, not explanation. There were few toys made specifically for children. Most play came from objects already at hand sticks, stones, scraps of cloth, bits of wood. Games existed, but they were simple and physical. Children ran, chased, wrestled, and climbed. They played games involving throwing stones or rolling hoops. Some games resembled work, mimicking plowing, cooking, or hunting. These activities strengthened bodies and prepared minds for future labor. Play was not separate from life. It was training disguised as fun. Time for play depended on circumstance. Children from poorer families had less freedom. They were needed sooner and more often. Tasks were small, at first washing animals, gathering fuel, carrying water, but responsibility grew quickly. Mistakes were corrected firmly. There was little patience for carelessness when survival depended on everyone's effort. Education was limited. Formal schooling was rare and usually reserved for boys destined for religious life or skilled trades. Most children learned what they needed to know from family members. Reading and writing were not essential for daily survival. Knowledge was practical, not abstract. Apprenticeships marked a turning point. Around the age of 7 or 8, some children left home to live with a master craftsman. This arrangement was both opportunity and risk. Apprentices learned skills that could secure their future, but they also surrendered comfort and familiarity. They worked long hours in exchange for training, food, and shelter. Life as an apprentice was strict. Obedience was expected. Discipline could be harsh. Mistakes were punished. Yet apprenticeships also offered structure and possibility. Mastery of a trade meant stability in a world where few paths were open. Girls often followed a different path. Many remained within the household, learning domestic skills, food preparation, textile work, and caregiving. Others entered service in wealthier homes, performing labor in exchange for protection and sustenance. Marriage often came early, bringing adult responsibilities while still physically young. Children were not shielded from danger. Disease, injury, and death were visible and common. Many children did not survive to adulthood. Those who did grew up aware of life's fragility. This awareness shaped their behavior. Caution was learned early. Despite the hardships, children still laughed, played, and formed friendships. They created moments of joy within narrow spaces. Songs, rhymes, and stories passed between them, changing slightly with each telling. These shared experiences built connection and relief. Parental affection existed, though it was expressed differently. High infant mortality encouraged emotional restraint. Attachment was cautious. Love was shown through care and provision rather than indulgence. Childhood ended not with ceremony, but with expectation. When a child was capable, they were treated accordingly. There was no waiting for readiness. Responsibility arrived when needed. This early transition shaped medieval society. Adults who had worked since childhood carried resilience and endurance. They were shaped by necessity rather than choice. In the medieval world, justice was not quiet or hidden. It unfolded in public spaces, shaped by community memory rather than written law. Punishment was meant to be seen, felt, and remembered. The goal was not rehabilitation as we think of it today, but correction through exposure. To break a rule was not just to offend authority, but to disturb the fragile balance of communal life. Most medieval communities were small. People knew one another well. Reputation mattered deeply because survival depended on trust. When someone stole, cheated, or caused harm, the entire community felt it. Justice, therefore, was communal as well. Courts existed, but many disputes were settled locally, guided by custom rather than strict codes. Fines were the most common punishment. Money, livestock, grain, or labor could be demanded as repayment. This approach reflected practicality. Removing a person entirely through imprisonment or execution meant losing a worker. Fines restored balance without destroying the community's labor force. Payment was also a form of acknowledgement. It publicly marked guilt. When fines were not enough, punishment became physical or symbolic. A pillory was one of the most familiar tools of public shame. It was a wooden frame placed in a busy area, often near a market or church. The offender's head and hands were locked in place, leaving them exposed for hours or even days. The pillory relied on the crowd. People threw rotten food, shouted insults, and mocked the offender. The punishment came as much from neighbors as from the law itself. Shame was the lesson. The memory lingered long after bruises faded. Stocks worked similarly, restraining the legs instead of the arms. They were uncomfortable and humiliating, forcing the body into awkward positions. Time passed slowly. Exposure to weather added another layer of suffering. Cold, heat, rain, and sun all played a role. Not all crimes received the same treatment. Theft, dishonesty, and public disorder were punished differently, depending on severity and status. Wealth and connections mattered. A fine that ruined one person might be trivial to another. Justice was uneven, shaped by hierarchy as much as morality. Community justice extended beyond formal punishment. Gossip acted as enforcement. A reputation damaged by wrongdoing could follow a person for life. Markets remembered cheats. Neighbors remembered violence. Trust once broken was difficult to rebuild. Public confession sometimes replaced physical punishment. Standing before the community and admitting guilt was a powerful act. Words spoken aloud carried weight. Silence was often interpreted as defiance. Violence was both feared and normalized. Minor assaults might be ignored or settled privately. Serious violence, especially murder, demanded response. Blood feuds existed in some regions, passed between families. Over time, authorities tried to contain these cycles by asserting control. Prisons existed, but they were not long-term solutions. They were holding spaces, not places of punishment. Confinement was temporary, uncomfortable, and unsanitary. The idea of serving a long sentence behind bars had not yet fully developed. Execution was rare compared to popular imagination, but it happened publicly when it did. Its purpose was deterrence. The act warned others of the consequences of defiance. Even so, communities often treated executions with a mix of fear and familiarity. Justice was not consistent. Laws varied widely between regions. Custom mattered more than written statute. What was acceptable in one village might be punished in another. This unpredictability kept people cautious. Punishment also reinforced social order. Crimes against property were often treated more seriously than crimes against people. Stability mattered. Anything that threatened economic balance or authority drew swift response. Despite the harshness, many medieval people accepted this system as necessary. Public punishment was understood as a reminder of shared rules. It reinforced belonging by showing what happened when one stepped outside it. Shame lingered longer than pain. The memory of standing exposed before neighbors stayed with a person long after the punishment ended. This lingering effect was intentional. Justice aimed to mark behavior, not erase it. As time passed, medieval justice slowly evolved, but its core remained public and communal. Law lived not in books, but in people's memories. For most medieval people, travel was not an adventure. It was a risk taken only when necessary. Life was centered close to home, and the world beyond familiar fields and roads felt uncertain and hostile. Distance was measured not in miles, but in effort, danger, and time. Roads were poor and unreliable. Many were little more than dirt paths worn into the landscape by feet, hooves, and carts. In dry weather, they were dusty and uneven. In rain, they turned to mud, swallowing wheels and slowing progress to a crawl. Stones, ruts, and sudden drops were common. A twisted ankle or broken axle could end a journey completely. There was no unified road system. Some Roman roads still existed, cracked and uneven, but most had fallen into disrepair. Bridges were rare and often unsafe. Rivers had to be crossed carefully, sometimes by ferry, sometimes by wading through cold, fast-moving water. A misstep could mean injury or death. Travel was slow. A healthy person on foot might manage a short distance in a day, depending on terrain and weather. Carts moved even more slowly. Horses were valuable and not owned by everyone. Even those who had access to animals had to rest them often. Speed was limited by endurance. Weather ruled everything. Rain soaked clothing and supplies. Wind cut through thin layers. Cold numbed hands and slowed movement. Snow could make roads disappear entirely. In winter, travel nearly stopped. In summer, heat exhausted travelers and spoiled food. Night travel was avoided whenever possible. Darkness made roads more dangerous and disorienting. Without proper lighting, obstacles became invisible. Sounds felt closer and more threatening. Travelers aimed to reach shelter before sunset, knowing the risks of being exposed overnight. Inns offered some relief, but they were unpredictable. They varied widely in quality and safety. Some provided warmth, food, and a place to sleep. Others were little more than crowded rooms filled with strangers. Cleanliness was rare. Beds were shared. Insects were unavoidable. Food quality depended on availability, not preference. Inns were also places of risk. Thieves and dishonest hosts were common concerns. Valuables were kept close or hidden. Travelers slept lightly, listening for unfamiliar movement. Trust was fragile. Bandits were a real threat. Isolated roads in forested areas provided cover for ambush. Travelers carrying goods or money were targets. Groups traveled together when possible, believing safety lay in numbers. Solitary travelers were especially vulnerable. Not all bandits were strangers. Desperate locals sometimes turned to theft during hard times. Hunger pushed people toward crime. This made trust difficult even among familiar faces. Travel required planning and resilience. Supplies had to last. Food needed to be durable. Bread hardened quickly. Dried meat and cheese were common, though they spoiled easily. Water was not always safe to drink. Travelers relied on ale or wine when possible. Purpose mattered. People traveled for trade, pilgrimage, service, or obligation, rarely for curiosity. Each journey carried a reason strong enough to outweigh fear. Pilgrimages were among the most common forms of long-distance travel. Religious devotion drove people to shrines and sacred sites. These journeys were exhausting and dangerous, yet undertaken willingly. Pilgrims traveled in groups, relying on shared faith for protection and endurance. For most, the world remained small. Villages, nearby towns, and familiar paths defined experience. Stories of distant places came through travelers and merchants, growing exaggerated with each telling. The unknown remained abstract and unsettling. Travel reshaped perspective. Those who returned brought news, ideas, and sometimes change. But many never returned at all. Staying close to home felt safer. Familiar roads, familiar faces, familiar risks. In a world where movement meant danger, stillness offered stability. In the medieval world, religion was not something set aside for certain hours or special occasions. It was always present, woven quietly into the rhythm of daily life. Like the steady hum of a distant sound, it formed a backdrop that people rarely escaped, and rarely questioned. Whether someone was deeply devout or quietly doubtful, religion shaped their days in ways both obvious and subtle. Bells marked time before clocks ever did. Church bells rang at set moments, calling people to prayer, announcing events, and warning of danger. The sound traveled far, carrying across fields and rooftops, reaching people wherever they happened to be. Bells did not ask for attention. They demanded it. Their tones signaled what kind of response was expected: solemn, urgent, or celebratory. Prayers structured the day. Morning prayers began the workday. Midday prayers offered pause. Evening prayers closed the day. Even those who could not read memorized short prayers, reciting them automatically. These words became familiar companions, spoken in moments of fear, fatigue, or gratitude. Religion also explained the unexplainable. When crops failed, illness spread, or storms destroyed homes, people looked to divine will. Suffering had meaning, even if it was not understood. This belief provided comfort, but also fear. God was seen as both protector and judge. Fear was a quiet but constant presence. Sin was believed to invite punishment, not just in the afterlife, but in daily life. Misfortune could be interpreted as a sign of moral failure. This encouraged careful behavior, obedience, and public displays of faith. Routine reinforced belief. Attending church was expected. Missing services was noticed. Community gathered weekly, reinforcing shared values and stories. Sermons were often the only formal education people received. Through them, people learned how to behave, what to fear, and what to hope for. Religious festivals broke the monotony of the year. They brought color, music, and communal joy. These moments offered relief, but they were still grounded in belief. Celebration and reverence coexisted. Religion also shaped sleep, work, and thought. Prayers before bed sought protection through the night. Blessings were spoken before meals. Important decisions were made with reference to divine guidance. Even those who questioned or doubted rarely did so openly. Belief was not just personal, it was communal. To reject it openly was to risk isolation. Religion provided structure in a world filled with uncertainty. It offered explanations where none existed. It softened fear by placing it within a larger narrative. The presence of religion was steady and unavoidable. Like breathing, it happened without conscious thought. It filled silence and gave shape to time. In the medieval world, death was never far away. It was not hidden behind closed doors or softened by distance. It moved through homes, streets, and fields, woven into everyday life with a familiarity that feels unsettling today. People did not encounter death only at the edges of existence. They lived alongside it, aware of its presence from an early age. Disease was one of the most common paths to death. Illness spread easily through crowded homes and narrow streets. Without understanding germs, people recognized patterns. Fevers came suddenly. Coughs lingered. Infections turned small wounds deadly. Epidemics arrived without warning and left devastation behind. Entire households could be lost within days. Death often occurred at home. The sick were cared for where they lived, surrounded by family and neighbors. There were no hospitals in the modern sense for most people. When someone weakened beyond recovery, it was expected that death would come quietly, often at night or in the early morning. Children witnessed this from a young age. They saw bodies grow still, heard final breaths, and watched rituals unfold. Death was not shielded from them. It became part of understanding life's fragility. Burials were simple for most. The body was prepared by family or community members. Washing and wrapping the deceased was an act of care and respect. Coffins were not always used. Many were buried in simple shrouds, laid directly into the earth. Graves were shallow and close together, especially in towns. Churchyards served as burial grounds. They were places of both reverence and routine. People walked through them daily, passing familiar names and markers. The dead rested near the living, their presence constant and visible. Grave markers varied. Some were marked with stones or wooden crosses. Others had nothing at all. Over time, markers decayed or shifted. Memory, rather than permanence, preserved identity. Disease shaped mourning practices. When death spread quickly, there was little time for elaborate rituals. Funerals were shortened or delayed. Fear of contagion altered behavior. Yet even during outbreaks, people tried to honor the dead within the limits of safety. Mourning was public and communal. Grief was shared openly. Clothing signaled loss. Dark colors, simple garments, or specific coverings marked those in mourning. These signs invited understanding and restraint from others. Prayers for the dead were essential. The soul's journey did not end with death. People believed the dead required assistance through prayer and remembrance. Masses were said. Candles were lit. Names were spoken aloud to keep memory alive. Grief was accepted as part of life. Tears were not hidden. Loud mourning, especially among women, was common. Expressions of sorrow were expected and understood. Silence could be interpreted as indifference. Death also brought practical concerns. Property had to be passed on. Work had to continue. Children needed care. Life resumed quickly, not out of coldness, but necessity. The presence of death influenced behavior. People prepared spiritually, mindful of the uncertainty of life. Final confessions were important. Settling disputes mattered. Death could arrive at any moment. Despite its constant presence, death was not always feared. It was understood as a transition. Faith offered a framework that made loss bearable. Ritual provided order in chaos. Living alongside death-shaped resilience. Medieval people developed a quiet acceptance. They grieved deeply, but they also carried on. Entertainment in the medieval world was not quiet, refined, or private. It was loud, physical, and shared. When people gathered for enjoyment, it filled streets, fields, and marketplaces with movement and sound. These moments stood in sharp contrast to the slow repetition of daily labor, offering brief but powerful relief from routine. Fairs were the heart of medieval entertainment. They arrived a few times a year and transformed familiar places into something almost unrecognizable. Open fields and town squares filled with stalls, banners, animals, and people from surrounding regions. The air buzzed with voices calling out prices, laughter, arguments, and music layered on top of one another. For many, fairs were the only time they encountered strangers. Merchants arrived with goods from far away. Performers traveled from town to town. Stories spread quickly, exaggerated with each retelling. A fair made the world feel larger, louder, and more alive. Physical games were common. Wrestling matches drew crowds. Tests of strength and balance entertained onlookers. People cheered, mocked, and placed small bets. Participation was encouraged. Entertainment was something you joined, not something you watched quietly from a distance. Music was simple but constant. Instruments were portable and loud enough to cut through noise. Drums, pipes, fiddles, and horns filled the air. Songs were repetitive and easy to remember. People sang along whether they knew the words or not. Music belonged to everyone. Dancing followed naturally. Circles formed, hands joined. Feet stamped the ground. Movements were energetic rather than graceful. Dance was a release of tension stored up during long workdays. It was social, communal, and often spontaneous. Storytelling held a special place. Without widespread literacy, stories traveled through voices. Storytellers performed in taverns, markets, and at fairs. They used gestures, facial expressions, and dramatic pauses to hold attention. Tales blended history, myth, humor, and warning. Each performance was slightly different, shaped by the crowd's reaction. Animals played a major role in entertainment. Trained bears, monkeys, and dogs performed tricks that fascinated audiences. These displays were rough by modern standards, but they drew crowds easily. Animals were familiar companions in daily life, and seeing them behave in unusual ways felt exciting and strange. Animal contests also occurred. Cockfighting and other brutal spectacles were common forms of entertainment. They reflected a world where violence was not hidden. Physical struggle was understood and accepted as part of life. Festivals tied to religious calendars brought sanctioned joy. Feast days encouraged celebration, music, and games. These events were loud by design, breaking the stillness of routine. They reminded people that pleasure had a place, even within a structured moral world. Taverns offered another form of entertainment. Conversation, drinking, games of chance, and music filled these spaces. Taverns were noisy and crowded, but they offered warmth and connection. Stories were shared. News traveled. Laughter came easily. Entertainment was rarely passive. Sitting quietly was unusual. People stood, moved, shouted, and reacted. Energy flowed outward. These moments were physically exhausting, but emotionally refreshing. Children participated freely. They ran between adults, mimicked performances, and joined games when allowed. Entertainment was intergenerational. Everyone shared the same space and sounds. These moments mattered deeply. They broke monotony. They strengthened community bonds. They reminded people that life held more than labor and survival. When fairs ended and performers moved on, silence returned slowly. Fields emptied, streets calmed. But the memory of noise and movement lingered, carried into the next long stretch of routine. Castles are often imagined as warm, glowing places filled with roaring fires, thick stone walls, and a sense of safety. In reality, living inside a medieval castle was rarely comfortable. These structures were built for defense first, and human comfort came far behind. Stone protected bodies from attack, but it did little to protect them from cold, dampness, and constant discomfort. Drafts were everywhere. Even the most solid-looking castle walls were full of gaps. Arrow slits, narrow windows, poorly fitted doors, and aging stonework allowed cold air to slip inside unchecked. Wind moved freely through halls, stairwells, and chambers, carrying the chill of the outside world with it. On stormy days, the sound of wind howling through stone corridors could feel endless. Fireplaces existed, but they were inefficient. A single hearth might warm a small area nearby, but the heat rarely reached far. High ceilings trapped warmth above head level, leaving people below cold and stiff. Firewood was expensive and required constant labor to gather and transport. Fires were carefully managed, not kept burning endlessly for comfort. Rooms were large and sparsely furnished. Stone absorbed cold during the night and released it slowly during the day, keeping interiors cool even in warmer seasons. In winter, this cold became penetrating and relentless. People layered clothing indoors, wearing wool and furs even while sleeping. Tapestries lined walls, not just for decoration, but for insulation. They helped block drafts and added a thin barrier against cold stone. Even so, dampness crept in. Moisture seeped through walls, settled into floors, and lingered in the air. The smell of wet stone was common, especially in lower levels. Hygiene in castles was basic and often unpleasant. Privies were built into walls, with waste dropping directly outside or into pits below. These spaces were cold, exposed, and poorly ventilated. In winter, using them was an uncomfortable ordeal. In summer, smells lingered. Bathing facilities were limited. Large tubs could be brought in for important occasions, but heating water required significant effort. Full baths were rare. More often, people relied on partial washing, using cloths and small bowls of water. Cleanliness depended on effort and necessity rather than routine. Dampness affected everything. Clothing never fully dried. Bedding absorbed moisture from the air. Wooden furniture warped over time. Mold grew in dark corners. This constant humidity contributed to illness, especially respiratory problems and joint pain. Sleeping quarters offered little privacy or comfort. Beds were heavy wooden frames with straw-filled mattresses. Curtains were sometimes drawn around beds to block drafts, creating a small pocket of warmth. These enclosed spaces helped slightly, but they also trapped stale air and insects. Noise traveled easily through stone halls. Footsteps echoed. Doors slammed. Voices carried. Castles were rarely quiet. Guards moved through corridors at all hours. Animals lived nearby. The sense of constant activity made rest difficult. Despite the discomfort, castles symbolized power and protection. Living within their walls meant safety from attack and access to resources. This trade-off was accepted. Cold and dampness were endured in exchange for security. Even nobles adapted rather than resisted. They dressed warmly, moved frequently, and relied on routine to manage discomfort. Comfort as a concept was secondary to function. Castles were not cozy homes. They were tools of survival and authority. Living in them required resilience and acceptance of hardship. As the fire dimmed and night settled, stone walls held the cold tightly. People slept wrapped in layers, listening to wind and echoes, enduring another night inside walls built to last far longer than comfort ever could. To a medieval person, life did not feel fast. It did not rush forward or slip away unnoticed. Instead, it stretched out, unfolding slowly, shaped by repetition and familiarity. Days passed one after another with little variation, and this sameness created a sense of time that felt wide and heavy, almost endless. Time was not measured precisely. Without clocks governing daily life, hours blended together. Morning began when light appeared. Evening arrived when darkness settled. Between these moments, work filled the space without sharp divisions. Time was felt through the body, through hunger, fatigue, and the position of the sun rather than numbers. Repetition defined experience. The same paths were walked. The same tasks were performed. The same meals were eaten. Weeks followed familiar patterns shaped by work and worship. Seasons returned predictably, carrying the same demands year after year. This repetition made time feel circular rather than linear. Memory functioned differently. Without written records or constant news, people remembered through habit and storytelling. Important events stood out sharply, while ordinary days blended together. The past felt close because it was retold often. Stories of grandparents and great-grandparents were familiar, passed down as part of daily conversation. Life's pace encouraged patience. Waiting was common. Waiting for weather to change. Waiting for crops to grow. Waiting for illness to pass. There was little expectation of immediate results. Effort was invested without guarantee, and outcomes unfolded slowly. This slowness shaped perception. A single year could feel long and full. Each season carried its own challenges and rewards. Time was marked by change in the environment rather than by calendars. Without constant distraction, moments lingered. Silence had weight. Stillness invited reflection. People spent long hours with their thoughts, whether they wished to or not. This inward attention made time feel fuller, heavier. Endings came quietly. There were few dramatic transitions. Life stages blended together. Childhood faded into work. Work continued until the body failed. Aging was gradual, marked by small losses rather than sudden change. Memory softened hardship. Difficult moments faded over time, while familiar routines remained. People remembered patterns more than details. This selective memory made life feel stable, even when it was hard. The absence of urgency created a different relationship with time. There was no pressure to optimize or hurry. Life unfolded at the speed it demanded. Acceptance replaced ambition for many. As night fell, days closed gently. Tomorrow would resemble today, and the next day much the same. In this repetition, medieval people found endurance. Life felt endless, not because it was long, but because it was deeply familiar. Time did not escape them. It surrounded them, slow and steady, carrying them forward without hurry. As we drift away from this world, let its calm rhythm linger. The slow passing of hours, the steady return of seasons, the quiet understanding that life, in all its repetition, continues gently onward. You've now reached the end of our medieval journey. Settle in, let the rhythm slow, and rest